I still remember the smell of antiseptic and burned rubber when I finally opened my eyes, that sharp mix that tells you your life has been split into a before and an after. The ceiling above me was too white, the lights too bright, and my body felt like it belonged to someone else. I tried to move my arms and couldn't. Panic rose in my throat, but then another thought crashed into me harder than the accident itself. My baby. My newborn son. The last thing I remembered before the sound of metal folding in on itself was his tiny face in the rearview mirror, asleep in his car seat, his chest rising and falling like a promise I had sworn to protect. I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry and my voice came out as a cracked whisper, asking where he was, asking if he was okay. A nurse leaned over me, calm and practiced, telling me my son was alive, that he'd been checked and released with only a few bruises, that he was safe. Safe. The word should have soothed me, but it didn't, because the next question pushed out of me before I could stop it. Where's my mom? My mother had been the loudest voice during my pregnancy, the one who insisted she would be there no matter what, the one who told everyone how excited she was to be a grandmother. I expected her to be the first face I saw when I woke up, holding my baby, telling me everything would be okay. The nurse hesitated, and that pause told me more than words ever could. She glanced at my chart, then back at me, and said gently that my mother had been contacted. She said my mother declined to come to the hospital. Declined. Like it was an invitation to a party she didn't feel like attending. I remember staring at the nurse, convinced I'd misheard her, convinced the beeping machines around me were distorting sound. I asked her to repeat it. She did, softer this time, adding that my grandfather had also been contacted and that he was on his way. My chest tightened, a deep ache that had nothing to do with broken ribs or bruised organs. My mother refused my newborn. Not just me, him. In the hours that followed, drifting in and out of sleep, memories started stacking up in my mind like evidence I had ignored for too long. My mother and I had always had a complicated relationship, one built on conditions and expectations. She loved me when I fit into the version of a daughter she could show off. When I got pregnant unexpectedly, unmarried and scared, something in her shifted. She never said outright that she was ashamed, but it was there in the silences, in the way she corrected people when they congratulated her, in the way she insisted I fix my life quickly. She'd offered help, but it always came with rules, with reminders of how much she was sacrificing for me. Still, when my son was born, I thought he had softened her. She held him at the hospital, smiled for pictures, told nurses she'd never loved anything more. I believed that meant something. Lying there, I realized how wrong I'd been. When my grandfather arrived, I knew it before I saw him. The room felt different, steadier, like an anchor had been dropped. He took my hand carefully, his eyes scanning my face the way they used to when I was a child, and scraped my knees. He didn't say much at first. He just stayed, letting me cry without trying to stop it. When I finally told him what the nurse had said, his jaw tightened in a way I'd only seen a few times in my life. He didn't ask if it was true. He already knew. He told me quietly that my mother had said she couldn't deal with this situation, that she didn't want to be responsible for a baby while I was unconscious, that it was all too much. Hearing it framed that way felt like being hit all over again. My grandfather squeezed my hand and said, "She made a choice." There was no softness in his voice now. He told me he'd made one too. He stepped out of the room to make a call, and I watched the door close behind him, not understanding yet that everything was about to change. When he came back, he told me my son was with him, that he'd picked him up himself, that he was safe and fed and sleeping against his chest just like I used to when I was little. Relief washed over me so strong it made me dizzy, but beneath it was something else, something heavier. My grandfather sat down and told me that what my mother had done wasn't just about fear or inconvenience. He said it was about control, about image, about her refusal to stand beside me when things weren't perfect. He told me that when he'd called her, he hadn't yelled, he hadn't pleaded. He simply told her that if she could walk away from her daughter and her grandson in their most vulnerable moment, then she should be prepared for the consequences of that choice. I didn't know what those consequences were yet, but the look in his eyes told me they were real. As the pain medication pulled me back toward sleep, I held on to one truth like a lifeline. My mother may have refused my newborn during my car accident, but my grandfather's one call had already started something that could never be undone. When I woke again, the pain felt sharper, more insistent, like my body was reminding me of every single place it had been damaged. But underneath it all was a strange calm, the kind that comes after you realize the worst thing you feared has already happened. My grandfather was still there, asleep in the chair beside my bed, his chin tucked to his chest, one hand curled protectively around the strap of the baby carrier at his feet. Seeing that carrier grounded me in a way nothing else could. My son was here. He was close. He hadn't been abandoned, even if my mother had tried to pretend he wasn't her problem. When the nurse brought my baby in later that morning, I cried so hard I had to turn my face away, embarrassed by the sounds coming out of me. He was so small against the white hospital sheets, his tiny fingers curling and uncurling like he was searching for something familiar. When I touched his hand, he calmed instantly, and in that moment I felt both overwhelming love and crushing guilt. I had put him in that car. I had trusted that my family would catch me if I fell. Only one of them actually had. As the day went on, bits of information filtered in. The accident had been caused by a distracted driver running a red light. There would be insurance calls and paperwork and weeks of recovery ahead. But none of that felt as heavy as the silence from my mother. No calls, no messages, not even a text asking if I was alive. It was my grandfather who finally told me more about that phone call. He said when he called her, she'd sounded irritated, not worried. She'd complained about the timing, about how inconvenient it was, about how she had work and plans and couldn't drop everything. When he told her I was unconscious and my baby needed someone, she'd said, "That's not my responsibility." Hearing those words relayed to me felt like a slow burn across my chest. Not my responsibility, as if love were optional, as if blood meant nothing when it interfered with her comfort. My grandfather told me he'd gone very quiet after that. He told her he was ashamed of her. He reminded her of the nights he'd stayed up with her when she was sick, the sacrifices he and my grandmother had made without ever calling them responsibilities. Then he told her that until she could face what she'd done, she was not welcome near me or my child. I asked him if that was really his place, and he looked at me with a sadness that made me feel small again. He said it was always his place to protect his family, even when the threat came from within. Over the next few days, my phone finally buzzed with messages from my mother. They weren't apologies, they were explanations, justifications wrapped in defensiveness. She said she was overwhelmed. She said she panicked. She said I didn't understand how hard it was for her to see me like this. Every message centered her feelings, her fear, her stress. Not once did she ask how my son was doing. Not once did she say she was sorry for refusing him. I didn't respond. I didn't have the strength to argue or beg or explain why what she'd done had cut so deep. My grandfather handled the practical things, bringing my baby to visit, coordinating with nurses, making sure I wasn't alone. He slept in that chair every night until the doctors finally insisted he go home to rest. When I was discharged, he took us both to his house. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and steady and full of memories of a time when family meant showing up no matter what. As I healed, physically and emotionally, the reality of my mother's absence settled in. Friends came by, distant relatives sent cards, but my mother stayed away, respecting my grandfather's boundary while quietly telling anyone who would listen her version of events. I heard later that she'd said I was keeping her grandson from her, that I was being dramatic, that my grandfather was manipulating me. Those lies hurt, but they didn't surprise me anymore. What surprised me was how much lighter I felt without her constant judgment hovering over me. One afternoon, as my son slept on my chest, my grandfather sat across from me and told me something he'd never shared before. He told me about his own childhood, about a mother who had chosen pride over her children, about the promise he made to himself to never repeat that cycle. He said watching my mother walk away had broken his heart, but it had also clarified things. He told me that family wasn't about titles or expectations. It was about who shows up when everything falls apart. Weeks later, my mother finally showed up at my grandfather's door unannounced. I wasn't ready to see her, but part of me knew this moment was coming. She looked smaller somehow, her confidence cracked just enough to reveal anger underneath. She demanded to see her grandson. My grandfather stood between us and told her no. He told her that until she could take responsibility for her choice, truly and honestly, she had no place in our lives. She cried, she accused, she tried to make him the villain, but he didn't move. Watching him stand there, unwavering, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, I understood that protecting my child might mean protecting him from his own grandmother. When she finally left, slamming the door behind her, I didn't feel the devastation I expected. I felt resolve. The accident had taken a lot from me, my sense of safety, my trust, my illusions, but it had also given me clarity. My mother's refusal during my darkest moment had revealed a truth I could no longer ignore. And my grandfather's one call had done more than change everything. It had shown me what real love looks like when it's tested. Recovery has a way of stretching time, turning days into long, quiet stretches where your thoughts get louder than any noise around you. As my body slowly healed, my mind kept circling back to the same question. How did it come to this? How did my own mother become someone I had to protect my child from? Late at night, when the house was still and my son slept beside me in his bassinet, I replayed my childhood in fragments. Birthday parties she threw that looked perfect in photos but ended with her snapping at me for embarrassing her. Achievements that were celebrated publicly but critiqued privately. Love that always felt just a little conditional. I realized I had spent my whole life trying to earn something that should have been freely given. The accident didn't create that truth, but it exposed it. One afternoon, while my grandfather was out picking up groceries, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to pick up. It was my aunt, my mother's younger sister, someone I hadn't spoken to much over the years. Her voice was hesitant, like she wasn't sure how much she was allowed to say. She told me she was calling because she didn't agree with what my mother had done, and she wanted me to know I wasn't wrong for setting boundaries. Then she said something that made my heart stop for a moment. She told me this wasn't the first time my mother had walked away when things got hard. She reminded me of a time when I was a toddler and my grandmother was sick, how my grandfather had handled everything while my mother couldn't cope. Hearing that felt like another puzzle piece sliding into place. It wasn't that my mother didn't love us, it was that she loved herself more when love required sacrifice. That night, when my grandfather came home, I told him about the call. He nodded slowly, not surprised. He said people don't suddenly become who they are in a crisis. They reveal who they've always been. As weeks turned into months, my strength returned. I started physical therapy. I learned how to lift my son without wincing. I learned how to accept help without feeling weak. My grandfather never treated me like a burden. He treated me like someone rebuilding. One morning while feeding my son, I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. There was exhaustion there, yes, but also something steadier, a quiet determination. I was no longer just a daughter trying to please her mother. I was a mother myself now, responsible for breaking cycles, not continuing them. My mother didn't disappear. She sent more messages, some angry, some pleading. Eventually, the tone shifted. She started apologizing, but the word telling me how hurt she was, how excluded she felt. I listened, really listened, and then I told her my truth. I told her what it felt like to wake up broken and learn she'd refused my newborn. I told her how that choice had shattered my trust. For the first time, she didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was a long silence. She cried, not loudly, but with a kind of frustration, like she was mourning an image of herself that no longer held up. She admitted she'd been afraid, that she'd felt out of control, that she didn't know how to step into chaos. It wasn't an excuse, but it was honesty. I told her that if she wanted a relationship with me or my son, it would have to be on new terms. Consistent effort, real accountability, no rewriting history. She agreed, but I knew agreement wasn't the same as change. Time would tell. When I left that cafe, I felt lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because I'd spoken without fear. Back at my grandfather's house, holding my son, I understood something deeply. The accident had been a rupture, but it had also been a reckoning. My mother's refusal forced me to see her clearly. My grandfather's one call showed me what unconditional love looks like in action. I didn't know what the future held for my relationship with my mother, but I knew this. My son would grow up knowing that love shows up, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's hard. And I would never let him question his worth the way I once questioned mine. Life didn't suddenly become easy after that conversation with my mother, but it became clearer. There is a difference between peace and clarity, and I was learning to value the second one first. My days settled into a rhythm shaped by my son's needs and my own slow recovery. Morning light through the curtains, the soft weight of him in my arms, my grandfather humming old songs while he made coffee. These quiet moments became my proof that stability doesn't have to be loud to be real. My mother started calling once a week, always polite, always careful, like someone walking across thin ice. She asked about my son, about his milestones, about my health. I answered honestly but briefly. Trust, I'd learned, doesn't come back all at once. It's rebuilt in fragments if it comes back at all. Some weeks her voice sounded genuine. Other weeks I could hear the impatience underneath, the desire for things to go back to the way they were, where she was centered and unchallenged. My grandfather never interfered, but his presence was constant, a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone in navigating this. One evening, after my son finally fell asleep, my grandfather and I sat at the kitchen table long after our tea had gone cold. He told me about the years after my grandmother passed away, how he'd leaned on my mother more than he should have, how he'd overlooked her emotional distance because he was afraid of losing her too. He admitted he'd enabled some of her behavior, hoping love would be enough to soften her edges. Hearing him take responsibility for that surprised me. It also taught me something important. Even the people who love us deeply can make mistakes. What matters is whether they're willing to face them. As my son grew stronger, so did my resolve. I started looking for a small place of my own, somewhere close enough to my grandfather that we could still lean on each other, but separate enough that I could build a life on my terms. When I told my mother about my plans, she reacted with thinly veiled criticism, questioning my choices, warning me about how hard it would be. I didn't argue. I simply told her I was capable. That word, capable, felt like a declaration. The day I moved into my new apartment, my grandfather showed up early with a toolbox and a smile. He assembled furniture, hung pictures, and held my son when I needed a break. My mother arrived later, carrying gifts and unsolicited advice. She commented on the size of the place, the neighborhood, the lack of space. I watched myself respond calmly, setting boundaries without raising my voice. It felt like watching a new version of myself in action. At one point, she reached for my son, and I hesitated before handing him over. She noticed. Her face fell just for a second. That moment told me she was beginning to understand that trust once broken leaves a scar. Over the next few months, my mother tried harder. She showed up on time, she asked before giving advice, she apologized again, this time without qualifiers. I believed she meant it, but I also knew that intention didn't erase impact. I allowed her supervised visits, always present, always observant. My grandfather supported this approach, reminding me that protecting my child didn't mean punishing my mother. It meant prioritizing safety, emotional and otherwise. One afternoon, as my son took his first wobbly steps across my living room, my mother was there, clapping and laughing, genuinely delighted. I felt a swell of emotion watching them, a mixture of hope and caution. Healing, I realized, isn't linear. It's a series of small choices made over and over again. That night, after everyone left, I cried, not out of sadness, but out of release. The weight I'd carried since the accident was slowly lifting. I wasn't erasing the past, but I was no longer living inside it. My grandfather called me later to check in, his voice steady and warm. He told me he was proud of me, not just for surviving the accident, but for choosing a different path than the one laid out by fear and obligation. His words settled into me like a blessing. Looking back, I could see how one moment had changed the trajectory of my life. My mother's refusal had been devastating, but it had also forced me to step into my own authority. My grandfather's one call had drawn a line that protected me when I couldn't protect myself. Together, those moments reshaped my understanding of family. Family isn't about who demands your loyalty, it's about who earns your trust. As I tucked my son into his crib that night, I whispered a promise to him. I promised I would always show up, even when I was afraid, even when it was hard. I promised I would choose love that acts, not love that excuses itself. And in that quiet room, with the soft sound of his breathing filling the space, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, not because everything was perfect, but because I finally knew who I was and what I was willing to stand for. Time has a way of testing the promises we make in moments of clarity. As my son grew from a fragile newborn into a curious toddler, the choices I'd made after the accident were tested in ways I hadn't anticipated. Parenthood stripped away any illusion that boundaries, once set, stayed fixed on their own. They require maintenance, attention, courage. My mother's involvement in our lives continued in small, careful doses. She showed up to birthdays and holidays, always with gifts that felt a little too expensive, as if she could compensate for absence with abundance. I watched closely, listening not just to what she said, but how she said it. There were moments of genuine warmth, moments that reminded me of the mother I'd always hoped she could be. And then there were moments when old patterns surfaced, subtle criticisms, comparisons, the quiet pressure to do things her way. Each time, I addressed it calmly, firmly. I no longer waited for my grandfather to intervene. This was my family now. One afternoon, my mother asked if she could take my son for the weekend. The request hit me harder than I expected. Part of me wanted to say yes, to prove that we'd moved past the trauma. Another part of me remembered the hospital room, the nurse's hesitation, the word declined. I told her no. I explained that I wasn't ready, that trust was still being rebuilt. She was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. She didn't argue. That restraint told me more than any apology could. Later, I told my grandfather about the conversation. He smiled softly and said, "Growth is often quiet." Around that time, I finally returned to work, balancing my job with childcare and the constant mental load of single motherhood. It was exhausting, but it was mine. I was building a life defined by resilience, not resentment. My grandfather helped when he could, but he also encouraged my independence, reminding me that leaning on someone doesn't mean leaning forever. One evening, after a particularly long day, my mother showed up unannounced again. My chest tightened, old instincts flaring, but she surprised me. She apologized for not calling ahead and offered to help with dinner. We cooked together in my small kitchen, the air filled with the sound of sizzling pans and cautious conversation. At one point, she said something that caught me off guard. She said, "I know I failed you when you needed me most." There was no defensiveness in her voice this time, just regret. I didn't rush to forgive her. I simply acknowledged it. Healing, I was learning, doesn't require immediate absolution. It requires truth. As months passed, my son formed a bond with my grandfather that mirrored the one I'd had as a child. Watching them together, my grandfather teaching him how to stack blocks, how to wave at neighbors, filled me with gratitude. It also reminded me of the legacy I wanted to pass down: stability, presence, love without conditions. My mother, observing from the edges, seemed to understand that she was no longer the central figure, and slowly she adjusted. The real test came when I was hospitalized again, this time for a minor surgery unrelated to the accident. It was planned, routine, but it stirred up old fears. I asked my mother if she could watch my son for a few hours while my grandfather was at an appointment. She agreed immediately. No hesitation, no excuses. When I woke, groggy but stable, the first thing I asked was how my son was. The nurse smiled and said my mother had been there the whole time, holding him, soothing him, refusing to leave his side. I cried then, not because everything was forgiven, but because I saw effort where there had once been refusal. When I was discharged, my mother didn't make a show of it. She simply handed my son back to me and asked how I was feeling. That quiet consistency meant more than grand gestures ever could. Later, my grandfather called and said he was proud of both of us. He reminded me that change doesn't erase harm, but it can coexist with accountability. As I rocked my son to sleep that night, I reflected on how far we'd come. The accident had been a fracture, but it had also been a mirror, forcing each of us to confront who we were under pressure. My mother was learning to show up. My grandfather had reaffirmed his role as protector and guide. And I had learned that my worth and my child's was never up for negotiation. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it no longer scared me. I had survived the worst day of my life and come out with a clearer sense of self. I knew now that love isn't proven by words spoken in comfort, but by actions taken in crisis. And that lesson, hard-earned and deeply felt, would guide me for the rest of my life. By the time my son turned 3, the memory of the accident no longer lived in my body the way it once had. The scars were still there, faint lines and dull aches that surfaced when the weather changed, but they no longer defined my days. What defined them now were routines: breakfast conversations with a toddler who asked impossible questions, evenings filled with picture books and half-sung lullabies, and through it all, a careful, evolving relationship with my mother that required more intention than I ever imagined. She had continued to show up, slowly, imperfectly, but consistently. She attended preschool events. She asked before making plans. She listened when I corrected her, even when I could tell it bruised her pride. There were still moments when I caught a glimpse of the old her, the one who wanted control disguised as concern. But now I met those moments with calm firmness instead of shrinking. I'd learned that love doesn't mean silence. It means honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. My grandfather watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. Age had slowed him a little, but his presence remained a constant in our lives. He still picked my son up every Wednesday afternoon, still told him stories about when your mama was little, still showed up whenever I needed advice or just a steady voice on the other end of the phone. One afternoon, while we sat together watching my son chase bubbles in the yard, my grandfather told me he'd updated his will. I told him not to talk like that he wasn't going anywhere. He smiled gently and said it wasn't about leaving, it was about protecting what mattered. He told me he'd set things up so my son would always be taken care of and that I wouldn't have to rely on anyone who made love conditional. The weight of that gesture settled deep in my chest. It wasn't about money, it was about security, about knowing someone had thought ahead for us. That night, I lay awake thinking about legacy, about how the choices we make ripple outward, touching generations we may never fully see. My mother had begun to understand this too, I think. One evening, she asked me about the accident again, not defensively, not to rewrite it, just to understand how it felt from my side. I told her everything I hadn't been able to say back then, the fear, the betrayal, the way her refusal had cracked something fundamental in me. She listened quietly, tears in her eyes, and when I finished, she said she wished she could go back and make a different choice. I told her she couldn't change the past, but she could keep choosing differently now. She nodded, accepting that truth without argument. That was new. Life continued to test us. There were disagreements, misunderstandings, moments when it would have been easier to walk away entirely. But each time, I weighed my choices against one question. Does this protect my child's sense of safety and worth? If the answer was yes, I moved forward. If it was no, I held the line. That clarity became my compass. One day, my son came home from a visit with my mother and asked me why Grandma used to be mad at babies. The question hit me like a punch. I knelt down and asked him what he meant. He shrugged and said she'd told him she used to be scared when he was little. I chose my words carefully. I told him sometimes grown-ups make mistakes when they're afraid, but that it's our job to learn and do better. He seemed satisfied with that answer and ran off to play, but I sat there for a long time afterward, realizing how even the smallest comments can echo in a child's mind. Later, I spoke to my mother about it. She apologized immediately and promised to be more mindful. That conversation could have gone very differently a year earlier. Progress, I realized, isn't loud. It's measured in moments like that. The real turning point came on the anniversary of the accident. I hadn't planned anything special, but my body remembered. I was quieter that day, more inward. My mother noticed and asked what was wrong. When I told her, she grew very still. She said she hadn't realized the date. Then she did something I never expected. She thanked me for letting her still be part of our lives. She said losing that privilege, even briefly, had forced her to confront parts of herself she'd spent years avoiding. I didn't respond right away. Gratitude doesn't erase harm, but acknowledgement matters. That evening, my grandfather came over for dinner. We didn't talk about the accident directly, but there was a shared understanding in the room. After my son went to bed, my grandfather took my hand and said, "You broke a cycle." I asked him what he meant. He said, "You chose truth over comfort, boundaries over approval. You taught your child that love doesn't disappear when things get hard." His words brought tears to my eyes, because for the first time, I believed them. Looking back now, I see how one refusal and one phone call changed the course of my life. My mother's refusal showed me what I could no longer accept. My grandfather's call showed me what unwavering love looks like. And everything that followed was built on those two truths. I didn't get the family story I once imagined, but I got something better. A family that learned, painfully and honestly, how to show up. And in that hard-won space, I found my voice, my strength, and a future defined not by betrayal, but by choice. As the years moved forward, I started to understand that healing isn't something you finish, it's something you practice. Some days it felt effortless, like breathing. Other days it required conscious effort, especially when old memories resurfaced without warning. My son was 4 when he began asking more detailed questions about family, about who lived where, about why some grandparents came over more than others. Children have a way of sensing gaps, even when you try to fill them with gentleness. I answered honestly, but simply, always grounding my explanations in love and safety. I told him that families can look different, but what matters most is how we treat each other. My mother continued to be present, still cautious, still learning. I could see how hard it was for her to accept that she no longer held automatic authority in my life. But she tried, and effort, repeated over time, began to soften some of the sharpest edges between us. My grandfather, meanwhile, was aging in ways that were impossible to ignore. His steps slowed, his hands shook sometimes when he poured his coffee, yet his mind remained sharp, his advice as steady as ever. One afternoon, while my son napped, my grandfather asked me if I ever regretted how things had unfolded after the accident. The question surprised me. I thought about it carefully before answering. I told him I didn't regret the boundaries I set, even though they came with pain. I told him I regretted that they were necessary at all. He nodded as if that confirmed something he already knew. He said love doesn't protect us from grief, but it does give us the courage to face it. That conversation stayed with me, especially as life began to shift again. My mother invited us to spend a weekend at her house, something she'd been asking about for months. I hesitated, weighing the request against everything I'd learned. Eventually, I agreed, with clear expectations. The weekend was awkward at first, filled with forced cheer and careful politeness, but as time passed, something loosened. My son laughed freely, my mother followed my lead without pushing. There were moments when I caught her watching us with a look that felt like regret mixed with longing. It didn't erase the past, but it humanized her in a way that allowed me to breathe a little easier. When we returned home, I felt tired but strangely hopeful, not because everything was fixed, but because it was no longer frozen in that hospital moment. Around that time, my grandfather had a health scare. A minor stroke, the doctor said, caught early. Still, the fear it brought was anything but minor. Sitting beside his hospital bed felt like a painful echo of my own experience years earlier. This time, though, I was the steady one. I held his hand, I asked questions, I made sure he wasn't alone. My mother came too. I watched her closely, half expecting her to retreat when things felt overwhelming, but she didn't. She stayed, she brought meals, she took notes during doctor's visits, she showed up. Watching that unfold stirred something complicated inside me. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it added another layer to who she was becoming. After my grandfather was discharged, we all gathered at his house. He was weaker, quieter, but his presence still filled the room. At one point, he asked my mother and me to sit with him. He told us he didn't know how much time he had left, and he wanted peace between us. Not forced, not pretend, but honest. He said families fracture when silence replaces truth. Then he looked at my mother and said he was proud of her for staying this time. She cried openly, not trying to hide it. I cried too, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. In that room, I felt the full arc of our story: pain, distance, effort, and fragile connection. Life didn't slow down after that. My son started school, I took on new responsibilities at work, my mother became a more consistent presence, though always within the boundaries I'd set, and my grandfather, though changed, remained the emotional center of our family. One evening, as I tucked my son into bed, he asked me if I was scared during the accident. I told him yes. He asked me who helped me. I told him the truth. I told him his great-grandfather made sure we were safe. He smiled and said, "I want to be brave like that." His words hit me harder than I expected, because bravery, I'd learned, isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet decisions made when no one is watching. It's choosing to show up even when fear tells you to turn away. As I lay awake that night, I realized something else. The story I'd once told myself, that my mother's refusal defined my family, was no longer true. It was part of our history, yes, but it wasn't the whole story. The whole story included growth, accountability, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. It included a grandfather whose one phone call drew a line that changed everything. And it included a mother who, though deeply flawed, was trying to learn how to stand on the right side of that line. I didn't know what the future would bring. Families are fragile that way. But I knew this: my son would grow up knowing that love isn't proven by perfection, but by presence. That lesson, born from pain and carried forward with intention, felt like the truest inheritance I could give him. By the time my son turned 6, the word accident no longer made a space fall the way it once did. Time had softened the sharpest edges, replacing fear with curiosity and memory with meaning. He knew the story in pieces, filtered through age-appropriate truths and wrapped in reassurance. He knew there had been a crash, he knew I'd been hurt, and he knew that his great-grandfather had taken care of him when I couldn't. What he didn't fully know yet was how that moment had redrawn the map of our family. Some truths, I'd learned, are revealed slowly when the heart is ready to hold them. My mother had continued to show up, not perfectly, but persistently. She attended school plays, sat through parent-teacher conferences when I invited her, and learned, sometimes clumsily, how to support without controlling. There were still moments when her old instincts flared, when she tried to step in as the authority instead of the guest. Each time I reminded her gently but firmly of our boundaries. Sometimes she bristled, sometimes she apologized, but she listened. That mattered. My grandfather, meanwhile, had grown quieter, more reflective. The stroke had changed him, not just physically but emotionally. He spoke more openly now, as if aware that time was a resource he could no longer take for granted. One afternoon, he asked me to bring my son over so he could show him something. In the back of his closet, he kept a small wooden box filled with old photographs and letters. He showed my son pictures of me as a child, stories of scraped knees and bedtime fears. Then he looked at me and said he wanted my son to know where he came from, not just the good parts, but the resilient ones. That night, after my son fell asleep clutching one of those old photos, my grandfather told me he was proud of the woman I'd become. He said the accident had revealed my strength, but it was my choices afterward that defined me. Hearing that from him felt like a full circle moment, a quiet validation that settled deep in my bones. Life, however, has a way of continuing to test us. My mother's health took a sudden downturn not long after. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough to require surgery and a long recovery. When she asked me to help, I felt the old conflict rise. Part of me remembered how she'd refused to help me when I needed her most. Another part of me saw an opportunity to model the kind of compassion I wanted my son to learn. I agreed with clear limits. I helped coordinate care, brought meals, checked in regularly. I didn't overextend myself. I didn't abandon my own needs. And in doing so, I realized something important. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let the past dictate every future decision. During her recovery, my mother thanked me more than once, not in a performative way, but quietly, as if she was still learning how to receive help without shame. She admitted that my boundaries had forced her to confront her own fears of inadequacy and loss of control. Those conversations were uncomfortable, but they were honest, and honesty, I'd learned, is where real connection begins. My son watched all of this unfold with the intuitive wisdom only children seem to have. One day, he asked me why I helped Grandma even though she'd once hurt me. I told him because kindness doesn't have to wait for perfection, but I also told him it's okay to protect your heart. He nodded, absorbing the lesson in his own way. That balance, compassion without self-betrayal, had become my guiding principle. As the years passed, my grandfather's health declined further. He tired easily, his memory faltered at times, but his love never wavered. One evening, as we sat together watching the sun dip below the horizon, he told me he was at peace. He said he'd seen enough healing to know the family would be okay. I didn't want to hear that. I wanted to argue, to cling, but I listened, because love sometimes means honoring what someone is trying to tell you, even when it hurts. When he passed away quietly in his sleep not long after, the grief was heavy but clean. There were no unresolved conflicts, no words left unsaid. At his funeral, my mother stood beside me holding my hand. She cried openly, not caring who saw. She told anyone who would listen how he'd taught her what it meant to show up even when it was hard. Listening to her speak, I felt a complex mix of sorrow and gratitude. His one call had changed everything, and even in his absence, its impact rippled outward. After the funeral, my son asked me where his great-grandfather had gone. I told him he'd left us a lot of love to carry forward, and in that moment, I understood that this story wasn't just about betrayal or redemption, it was about legacy, about the choices we make when life breaks open. My mother's refusal had been a fracture, yes, but my grandfather's response and everything that followed had been the repair. And in that repair, I found a version of family that, while imperfect, was honest, resilient, and real. Grief changes the way time feels. After my grandfather passed, days blurred together, each one heavy with absence and memory. The house felt quieter without his steady presence, without the sound of his chair creaking as he stood, without his low hum drifting from the kitchen. My son noticed it too. He asked when we were going to see great-grandpa again, and each time I answered, my throat tightened. I told him the truth in the gentlest way I could, that some people live on in our hearts even when we can't see them anymore. He accepted that with a solemn nod that broke me in ways I didn't expect. My mother leaned on me more during that time. Losing her father stripped away the last layers of emotional armor she'd carried for years. She called often, sometimes just to sit in silence on the phone. I listened, but I also protected my space, mindful of not slipping back into old dynamics where I became her emotional anchor at the expense of myself. It was a delicate balance, one I navigated with more confidence than I ever would have before the accident. In the months that followed, we sorted through my grandfather's belongings together. Each object held a story: a worn watch he'd worn every day, a stack of handwritten notes he'd kept in a drawer, reminders to himself about appointments, birthdays, small acts of kindness he didn't want to forget. In one envelope, we found a letter addressed to me. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside, he'd written about the pride he felt watching me become a mother. He wrote about the phone call he'd made years earlier, how he hadn't hesitated because protecting us felt as natural as breathing. He told me that my strength gave him peace. I read that letter over and over, letting his words anchor me in moments when grief threatened to pull me under. My mother read it too, standing beside me, tears streaming down her face. She apologized again, not just for the accident, but for the years of distance that it followed. This time, her apology felt different. It wasn't about being forgiven, it was about being accountable. Our relationship continued to evolve, shaped by loss and reflection. She began attending therapy, something she'd resisted for years. She told me she wanted to understand why fear had ruled her decisions for so long. I supported her, but I didn't make her journey my responsibility. That distinction mattered. As my son grew older, he began to ask deeper questions. He wanted to know why his great-grandfather had been so important to us. I told him stories of his kindness, his steadiness, the way he showed up without needing to be asked. I told him about the phone call, about how one person's courage can change the course of a family. I didn't vilify my mother in those stories. I focused on the lesson, not the blame. That, too, was a choice. One evening, years after the accident, my mother and I sat together watching my son play in the yard. She turned to me and said she finally understood what she'd risked losing that day in the hospital. She said the thought of not knowing her grandson now, of being absent from his life, scared her more than anything. I listened, feeling the weight of that realization. I told her that fear could be a teacher if you let it. She nodded, eyes fixed on my son, as if imprinting the moment in her memory. Looking back, I see how the accident forced every one of us to confront uncomfortable truths. It forced me to stop chasing conditional love. It forced my mother to face her own limitations. And it allowed my grandfather to step fully into the role he was always meant to play, the protector who drew a line and refused to let it be crossed. My life didn't become perfect after that. There was still struggles, still moments of doubt and fatigue, but there was also a deep sense of alignment, a knowing that I was living in accordance with my values. I was raising my son in an environment where love was demonstrated, not just declared, where mistakes were acknowledged, not buried. As my son approached adolescence, I began to see the lessons taking root. He stood up for himself. He spoke openly about his feelings. He knew that adults could be wrong and that it was okay to expect better from them. Watching him grow into that awareness filled me with a quiet pride. One night, after he'd gone to bed, I stood alone in the living room, surrounded by the life I'd built. The path there had been shaped by trauma, yes, but also by resilience and choice. I thought about my grandfather's one call, about how different everything might have been if he'd hesitated, if he'd chosen comfort over confrontation. That thought still sent a shiver through me because it reminded me how fragile and powerful our decisions can be. In honoring his legacy, I resolved to keep choosing courage, even when it was hard, to keep showing up, even when fear whispered excuses, and to keep teaching my son, by example, that love isn't proven in perfect moments, but in the ones that demand the most from us.